unit at the Center on Law and Social Transformation, which is natural resources, climate, and indigenous rights. We start with a keynote by Leo Heller, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation. And he's also a researcher at research institution Fiocruz in Minas Gerais in Brazil. I would like to introduce Leo Heller by telling you how we met, and my first impression on him was the best impression I can say. So I went to Brazil for the World Water Forum, and each year, most of the years when it happens, then there is also an alternative forum that calls this World Water Forum the Forum of the Corporations. And they try to oppose. There is a strong idea that participating in this forum is legitimizing, and then they wouldn't take part in this forum. And then I was there attending both events, and we had a very large group of people attending one session organized by Leo Heller to discuss privatization of water supply services. And in this session, people from the Alternative World Water Forum came and were participating, and before they could start any argument against privatization, they would say, I'm only here because I was invited by Leo Heller. And I think this is so he managed to bring to the World Water Forum the voices opposing privatization, and then, creating the debate there. And it was so many people attending that they have to change the venue. It was like a huge line of people waiting in front of the door, which was initially planned for the event, and they had to find another larger place because it was too many people wanting to attend, and it was a great discussion. And also, I should also mention that it was he was extremely busy, but I saw many students going and saying, Leo, can we talk? I would like to talk about my project. And he was also taking the time to discuss with the students. And we are very thankful that this afternoon he will also be talking to our PhD students in a closed session this afternoon. So thank you, Leo. And after this introduction, please, we are looking forward to your keynote. Thank you.
Hello? Hello? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Lara. Very, very kind presentation. I don't think I deserve so nice words. So, good morning for everyone. My idea in this keynote is to present some basis of the human rights to water and sanitation, firstly. I will also introduce the mandate. What is this special rapporteur? How it fits into the mechanism of the Human Rights Council? And what are the main activities of what we call the special procedures of the Human Rights Council? This is a way to discuss with you different ways to address the human rights to water and sanitation through particularly the thematic reports that I submit to the Council. Then I will talk a little bit about the current picture in the world using some monitoring data from the SDGs, and to show to you some concerns related to the human rights to water and sanitation, particularly inequalities in the access to water and sanitation in several parts of the world. So my challenge is to do that in 1 hour or a little bit less, but let's see. Yeah, firstly, very quickly, the legal foundation of the human rights to water and sanitation. Yes, in the contemporary time, we can identify in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights the basis, the initial basis for all the economic, social, and cultural rights, in which the rights to water and sanitation usually are included. And we can identify in the Article 25(1) the reference to the standard of living. All people have the right to have a minimal standard of living, which includes housing, and some other rights, but obviously there is no reference to water at that time. Then in 1966, actually it entered in power in 76. We had the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that defined and give interpretation of this Article 25 and other articles on the Declaration that relates to economic, social, and cultural rights. But again, there is no mention to water here. Then in following years, there were some conventions that started to mention the right to water, the Convention on the Rights to the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we start to identify some references to the right to water, not the right to sanitation, but basically the right to water. And then in 2002, we had a very key document, the General Comment 15. Yesterday, I learned that we have someone here in the room that had an active role on this, on drafting this General Comment, our colleague Malcom. And this was a very key document because it gave an interpretation of the right to water. At this moment, again, only water, not sanitation, but it's a very complete and very comprehensive document with several definitions related to what's the meaning of the right to water, what are the obligations of states, etc. And then finally, in 2010, the General Assembly adopted a resolution recognizing explicitly the right to water and the right to sanitation. Now, sanitation was included as part of the right to water. In the same year, the Human Rights Council adopted another resolution with similar meaning. Then we had subsequent resolutions since 2010. In general, 1 year in the General Assembly, the other year in the Human Rights Council on the same issue, but giving interpretation of different aspects of those rights. One important thing that happened in these further resolutions was the resolution of the General Assembly of 2015 that recognized that the right to water and the right to sanitation are distinct rights. So this is the reason that now my mandate is called the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights. We are using the plural to signaling that we have two distinct rights, although we should consider that those rights are integrated. That they are at the same time distinct, but we need to address them in an integrated way. So this, in very general terms, these are the basis and the legal foundations, the main legal covenants and instruments that we use to give interpretation of different aspects of the human rights to water and sanitation. Very, very quickly, the human right to water includes different contents, and basically the right to water ensures everyone without discrimination to have water with these features: water available, physically accessible, affordable, safe, that means with a quality that ensures the protection of health of the users, and culturally acceptable. And water for personal and domestic use. This is an interesting discussion. Maybe in the roundtable we can go deeper on that. What about water for food? What about water for subsistence agriculture? What about water for other uses that are very, very key for the life of people, for instance, that live in rural areas? So this is something that I would say is still a little bit open, and it can be a matter for more development. This is another important aspect. We are not talking only about water at the household level, but also water in other spheres of life that requires safe water, like schools, hospitals, workplaces, etc., public spaces. These are some definitions of each of these elements of the normative content. I will not go in details on that. I will just highlight that, for instance, affordability is a very important element. Affordability is something very linked to human rights, and my perception is that affordability is not exactly in the culture of the water providers. They usually think on economic sustainability and not on the needs of the poorest part of the population. And into this element of affordability, one important definition is that disconnection due to the inability to pay can be considered a violation of the human rights, because people is not allowed to access the services because the incapacity to pay. For sanitation, we have similar definitions. We are talking about available services, physically and culturally accessible services, affordable again, safe, hygienic, and secure. We are obviously talking of a different issue than water quality. We are talking about the safe disposal of wastes in order to protect health. And in the right to sanitation, privacy and dignity are very key elements, and they are very particular for the right to sanitation and very linked to gender issues. We are talking basically about the protection of women and girls, and also LGBTI groups. Here again, some definitions of each of these elements of the normative content. I will not go in details on that. It's very important also to address the human rights principles. Those are principles applied to several economic, social, and cultural rights, not only the right to water and the right to sanitation. So equality and non-discrimination is a very key principle. Participation and inclusion also. I like very much this definition of every person is entitled to active, free, and meaningful participation. And this is very key in the water sector. The water sector has a tradition of a very technocratic approach. The engineers think that they know everything. They don't need to consult people. They know how to solve all the problems. And we know that it's not true. And so it's very important to include, and this is part of the framework of the human rights, include people in the decision-making process, particularly, and giving information, reliable and accurate information. Accountability is another very key principle of the human rights that needs to be applied to water and sanitation, and the very definition of progressive realization of the rights using the maximum available resources. So this is very important, this last definition, because it's important to highlight that in 2010, the resolution in the General Assembly was not adopted by consensus. We had 41 countries that voted, that abstained, actually. 123 that voted in favor and 41 that abstained. And there were an attempt in 2010 to adopt a similar, 2008, to adopt a similar resolution that was not approved because most of the countries were contrary to this adoption. And it's important to think why I'm talking about that now, because some of the countries that were not in favor of the resolution thought that if I support the resolution, I will be called violator tomorrow because a significant part of my population has no access to water or sanitation. But it's a wrong interpretation of the principle of the human rights. What is supposed to happen is a progressive realization and not a realization from the night to the day. of the approval of the resolution. So this is a key element that means that all the efforts should be taken to ensure a progressive realization of those rights. So, and yeah, my feeling that we need to have a more in-depth discussion on that and how to translate this definition to the water and sanitation sector. Yeah, the special procedures of the human rights, we are part of those mechanisms related to the international human rights framework. There are several mechanisms. Some are bodies related to treaties. We have here several acronyms, but some are related. For instance, CEDAW is related to discrimination against women. The first one is the Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There is a body on people with disability, children, etc. And there are some mechanisms that are based on the Charter of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, and under the Human Rights, not under, together with, maybe it's better to say that because you are not linked formally to the Council. We have the special procedures and also this review that is very key, the Universal Periodical Review. So the special procedures are appointed by the Council. There are three different types of special procedures, the special rapporteurs, the working groups, and independent experts. We are now 47 thematic mandates and 12 country mandates. And in those thematic mandates, we have several subjects related to human rights that are covered by the rapporteurs. I'm the rapporteur on water sanitation. I have a colleague that works with housing, other with health, education, extreme poverty, and there are several related basically to political and civil rights, like independence of judges, torture, etc., etc. And 12 deal with some particular countries that deserve a special attention in terms of human rights, like Belarus, Libya, Eritrea, and several others. We are independent, non-UN staff, and not paid. The no payment is a very important particularity of the mandate because it provides the necessary independence. It's a very time-consuming mandate. When I applied to the mandate, the official letter said that I need to plan my life to spend 3 months a year on the mandate. And I think I spent 3 months a year out of the mandate. So it's very time-consuming. And this is a problem because not everyone has the capacity to devote that time to a mandate. We have a lot of colleagues that are retired, but this cannot be a criteria to appoint people. You need to be retired. Well, what's our role? Myself, need to submit 2 thematic reports per year, one for the General Assembly and the other to the Human Rights Council. I undertake 2 country missions per year to 2 different countries. And there is a set of activities related to communications with countries, with governments, when we receive elements that show a possible violation of human rights. And this also involves press releases, the dissemination of those violations to the press, and engagement with authors. So we have a very broad set of activities, but I would say that basically these 2 first are the more standard activities that we need to perform. So I wanted to explain a little bit about the thematic reports, because I think this is one of the main contents of the mandate. And here we have some tips on elements of those human rights that requires more understanding, more research, more in-depth approach, I would say. So far, I developed 10 thematic reports. My term is finishing next year, so I will give 12. So in these 10 thematic reports, I try to use this very simple three-dimensional framework, trying to identify subjects that are included in one of these three dimensions. The first dimensions are what I'm calling drivers that are macro determinants that can allow violations or realization of the rights. I will show some of the examples on that. In this case, using the human rights as an analytical lens to identify situations or phenomena that can influence the realization of the rights. The second policy, mainly public policies, and how to think on elements of public policies that can support the realization of the human rights, water and sanitation. And the third dimension, people, here I'm addressing some particular groups that deserve more attention in terms of how to realize the rights to those groups. And under the first dimension, drivers, 3 of my reports addressed it. In 2015, I worked on affordability. Affordability, I still think, is something that deserves more exploration, more investment, more theoretical and empirical investment, because, as I said before, the water sector is not very aware, is not very focused on providing affordable services for those that need it. Accountability was a report of last year, 2017. And again, accountability is something not very familiar to the water sector, is very necessary to translate all the elements of accountability into the reality of water sector. And this can be a way to realize the rights in a more specific way. And Mega Project was a report that I just finished and I just submitted it. It's again, elements that are external of the water sector that can impact the realization of the rights in several ways. And on policy, one first report was on level of services. Level of services meaning, this was an important moment because 2015 was the year of the negotiation of the SDGs. And the level of services adopted in the MDGs was a level of services, the definition of the level of service, at least the level of service that was monitored by the UN agencies, was very far from the standard that the human rights to water and sanitation prescribed. And the idea was to discuss different levels of service and in which extent they can be used to realize the human rights. But here I also worked with the idea of management. So the level of service is not independent of the management of the services. Then a report in 2017 was on regulation, regulatory bodies, regulatory entities that are very, very common in the water sector, particularly when we have one provider. This is the standard of the water sector. The characteristic is that it's a natural monopoly, and usually we have only one provider and a regulator, and there is a big challenge in how to regulate a monopoly. And usually the regulators are very focused on the economic side of the provision, not on the human rights. So the idea was to explore different ways of regulating. And there were 2 reports on development cooperation, trying to address the way funders use the framework of the human rights to water and sanitation. And on people, I had a report on gender, then a report on forcibly displaced persons, refugees, migrants, IDPs, stateless, and one of my latest reports were on spheres of life beyond the household, focusing particularly or mostly on public spaces. I discuss institutions, but the main focus is on public space. So these are three groups, maybe, that are usually neglected, not very well. They are sometimes invisible for the providers, particularly these two ones, two latest. And the first one, the impacts on the lack of the deficient of services on women, girls, transgender is not very visible as well. So these are some examples. So if you want suggestions on themes to research, you have a very comprehensive menu here. Yeah, so what's the relationship between the human rights to water and sanitation and the SDG? I will highlight some issues. One is that it's interesting to know that in the document that introduces the SDGs, Transforming Our World, the only right that is explicitly mentioned is the right to water. So this puts responsibility in implementing the related targets. We have two targets more linked to the right to water and the right to sanitation. Target 6.1. The goal 6 is about water and sanitation for all. This goal has 6 targets and 2 more that are implementation, means of implementation targets. But the targets more related to those rights are 6.1, that is related to water, and 6.2 related to sanitation. And this is the language of the targets, and we can identify in these languages several of that elements that I presented in the normative content of the right. So we have I would say, an adequate alignment between the targets, the language of the targets, and the framework of the human rights. They are not the same. Human rights are different than the SDGs, but this alignment is very welcome. One problem is that when the UN translated the targets into indicators, we lost several of those contents. So we can see, for instance, in target 6.2, the target is to achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. Everything was summarized in safely managed services. So this gap here is something that is a concern because we can lose several elements of the human rights in the monitoring process. Safely managed services can be defined in different ways, and we can, in this process, have some losses. It's important also to highlight the interrelationship between goals. And obviously, the goal 6 is related to several others: health, ending poverty, women, equality, reduction of inequalities in general, work, education, etc. So it's very important to have this cross-sectoral approach. And on the monitoring process, I would say that one of the main challenges is how to identify or how to disaggregate data in order to identify where the inequalities take place. So there are some possible disaggregation of data. One is that the monitoring is doing relatively well is the disaggregation based on wealth quintiles. the two agencies that are monitoring the SDGs on water and sanitation are WHO and UNICEF through the JMP, Joint Monitoring Program. The other dimension is rural-urban. They are doing well because these data are available through census and other types of surveys. The second one is more challenge, how to monitor intra-urban inequalities, and we know that the cities are not homogeneous. Group-related inequalities, race, ethnicity, and migratory status also are important, and we have few data on that. And intra-household inequalities is very important, but it's not possible to do it globally. It requires, I would say, more qualitative methods to understand that inside a household, we don't have an homogeneous population also. We have the elderly, children, people with disability, with different requirements in terms of access to water and sanitation. So there are some data on those inequalities. This is a map on safely managed sanitation, and we can see this is just a confirmation that we have extreme gaps between countries. We are here, I think, yeah? And this is very different than here, or here, yeah, or here. So we have a large range of proportion of access to those services from 0 to 25 to almost 100%. It's interesting because Norway is not in the top country, only Finland, I think. Something to think about.
Mountain cabins without sanitation.
Maybe the indigenous groups in the north, the extreme north. So inequalities across countries is very common. Here is a very interesting graph that the latest report shows. The first one showing difference in access between urban and rural and urban, and we can see that this is almost a standard across all the countries. In some countries, the gaps are larger, in others we are talking here mainly about European countries, I think. The gaps are not that big. And here, between wealth quintiles, showing that the richest, the most adequate is the access. And the gaps used to be very large here also. This is an exercise that we at Fiocruz did for the PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, comparing two very... the idea here is to recognize that the deprivation takes place together with several layers of deprivation. So here we compare two groups, one urban population, white people, in households with persons with graduate courses. And then with rural population, black people in families with people with elementary level of education in some countries in Latin America. You can see that, for instance, in El Salvador, the gap is 92 percentage points between the two groups. So this shows that the inequalities in the access to, here is sanitation, can be very, very large. This is a graph in the latest report of JMP showing gender inequality. Not all countries we have this data, and they used an example from Sierra Leone, showing then when water is collected, is not available at the household level. In 60% of the situations are the women that collect water, and in 13 girls. Here, I think it's the same. I made a mistake. I wanted to show inequalities between indigenous groups and non-indigenous groups. in the next keynote I'll bring. This is interesting also. It was produced by the JMP again, showing that we need to be careful when we use averages. Averages mask inequalities. Here is an example of Guyana. It's an statistic about the population using improved drinking water sources. And here is the average of the world. Here, when we break down in different regions, so here you have around 75%. In sub-Saharan Africa is 22. So if we use the world average, we are masking several differences. When we take Latin America and the Caribbean, we can see the gaps. When we take Guyana, urban and rural is not that big, the difference. But when we use wealth quintiles in the urban area, we can see the gap. And when we disaggregate by department, states, I'm not sure, we can see also a huge difference. So it's very important also to break down the data and to show, not only because of an academic exercise, but when we show these inequalities, we are showing to the government what needs to be done, and this is a way to inform public policies. This is my view. We don't have good policies for what we don't know. So this is the main idea here. I will skip this and discuss a little bit this graph that was produced also by the JMP. This is a very interesting way to show the progress. Here we are comparing 2000 and 2017. And there are 4 areas here. In this area, we have countries that increased the coverage between these 17 years and increased equality. Okay, this is what they are supposed to do. But the more concerned is this part here, where the countries increased the coverage, but increased inequalities also. So the public policies were traditionally oriented to support those that are wealthiest, that have more resources to access the services. And here also there are, I think the main decreasing. Here's the worst situation. The coverage decreased and inequality increased also. So I think it's very important to see that. This is related to the progressive realization. Yeah? And the idea is that the countries focus on the population that has less resources, that are more vulnerable, that live in more vulnerable situation, and that are discriminated in the public policies. So this is the main challenge of the SDGs, and this is the main message, I'll say, of the human rights to the implementation of the SDGs. And synthesizing that, I would say that in all the countries, in the beginning of the period, we have always disadvantaged groups and advantaged groups, and if business as usual will be applied, we will have this. But the message of the human rights is to prioritize these disadvantaged groups and to try to close this gap as soon as possible. There are several discussions around that. People from the water sector would say, but if I do that, the systems will not be sustainable, economically sustainable, because I'm putting services in those that can't pay. But I don't agree with this argument. There are several ways to address that, but this is the main message of the human rights, and I would say this is the main message of also the 2030 agenda. The main slogan is leaving no one behind, and we need to leave no one behind as soon as possible. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Care.
Questions? To Leo first. I think we're going to be questions to Leo first, and then I think it's good to have questions.
So we take questions.
Yeah, I think it's good to.
Okay, I'll take this off. It's very hot.
I think there's going to be questions.
Okay, I'll go there. You have a session of Q&A?
Yes, no, I think that'd be very helpful. And then we'll do a short Q&A, then we'll do the
Okay.
panel, and then we'll do more Q&A.
Okay.
So you don't get off that easy.
Now you can speak.
So now it's on?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks. An incredibly interesting talk from Leo, and it's actually really nice to be in a room with so many people who are actually key in this particular project, and people who work on the real world of the project, and there's academics, the likes of myself, who are on the other side of the thing, trying to figure out with what you do is actually what you think you do, or we think you're doing, and people like Malcom who were actually sitting there before, like sitting down, typing out the whole thing in the first place, and writing up the report. So here's what we're going to do for this particular part of the project, right? So this is a project that we've had funded now for 2 years. I have to say, first off, that we have only very, very preliminary results, but we do have interesting things to say. The project was sort of set up almost like as a natural experiment. That is, we were looking at what is the effect of having a human right to water and sanitation. Right? Does it actually make a difference? So this speaks to a whole bunch of different literatures. It speaks to the question about, do human rights make a difference? Should we be expending all our time writing up these rights and identifying rights and then turning them into national instruments? Or should we find other ways to do this, right? So we were actually interested in what is the impact of this particular right, because this is both it's a basic human right, as the 2010 right emphasized, but it's also a basic provision of goods and services, right? So it's the double whammy. It's the perfect case to figure out, does it make a difference? Okay, so the project then has this before and after question. It's like a natural experiment because everything else is held constant. And you might say, okay, so maybe like the general comment is where you should be starting from, but you can do that too. That's not a problem. So we could look at actually both, whether it's the general comment or the 2010 one. But looking at what has been the impact and how is this articulated, how is it used? And so we picked a bunch of countries that were mainly middle-income countries. Some have the right to water in the constitution already, others do not. Some have the right to water haven't been articulated by courts in their jurisprudence, and so it varies across cases. So we can actually start to unpack this and come up with some very interesting findings. We also included the United States, which, of course, never signs any sort of international treaty, because what the hell, somebody might make you do something after that and come and get you, and then there'll be these people from the United Nations with blue berets on, rounding up people in Texas. So this is always a constant fear when we live in the United States. So, but the interesting thing about the US is it's used in certain types of protest. Okay, it is articulated. People talk about the human right to water and sanitation. So this is sort of, it's an unusual, sort of a puzzling kind of outcome. So that's partly why that one was actually in there. So very briefly, and then we're going to allow, what we're going to do is we're going to have each of the people, we have 3 people with country case studies who are here, who are going to address very briefly what's happening in those countries and what we've learned so far. And we have Malcom, who I'll have to keep on a very short leash, who has lots to say about lots of things, so the goal will be to give him a little thing to say and then allow him to do that. And then we'll come back to Q&A for Leo Hella and for the people on the panel. So the project then includes South Africa, the United States, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, India, Costa Rica. Did I leave anything out? And the people involved, many of them are here. So we're going to hear from 3 of them in a minute. They'll introduce themselves. Namita Wahi, Lara Cortes, who's in Peru, and Evelyn Villareal, and Malcom Langford, who I think people know already. But there are other people who are in the audience, Camila Gianella, who works in Peru with a really interesting case study. Catalina is sitting over here, who's working on Colombia, another very, very interesting case study. And there's also been like the synergy between cases where we're looking at what's happened across cases. So they have a paper looking at constitutional amendments, right? And how, again, the right to water is articulated inside constitutions. We have Rebecca Sciel, who does the sort of data work that you're showing here, which I think is fascinating, right? And we have lots of data, right? That's the thing. And you start to see patterns appearing in the data that don't actually, well, they're not obvious, okay? That democracies are not necessarily better at doing this than autocracies, which is, to me, was like shocking, but that's what the data says. So then we have Jackie Dugard in South Africa and Inga Winkler, who used to work for your predecessor, doing the US case, and myself, and Dan Brinks, who's at UT Austin. So without further ado, I think if we could have each of the three of you, actually no, let's start with Malcom. Because Malcom, okay, so here's the weird thing, right? When you work on something like this, Malcom actually wrote the damn thing. Well, he's helped write the thing. So maybe the question for Malcom is you waiting? So you worked on this human right to water in making it a reality. So what did you think it was going to do, and what has it actually done in your mind? Yes? The general comment 15 you were involved in, and the 2010 one? Well, why didn't you explain? So, Malcom. And if you could keep these like brief so we can have this Q&A, because that's going to be the best part of the project.
Okay, so thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Leo Heller, for a fantastic lecture, and I'll indicate the importance of Leo's work as I speak. The interesting thing about the right to water is it doesn't start in the global north, it starts in the global south. Okay, because Western countries, Latin American countries dominated the drafting of the Universal Declaration, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, but they put in food, housing, clothing. China suggested transport, that wasn't put in, but no one thought about water. And it's actually mostly in developing countries where you see South Africa put the right to water in its constitution in 1994, put right to sanitation in some of its legislation. Indian courts who recognise the right to water already and in the 1980s. And in 1980, a right to sanitation, first out in the world. How does this trickle up to Geneva? Basically what happens is you see the confluence of three different movements. The first is an anti-privatization movement, responding to the promotion by the World Bank and the IMF of privatization of urban water services across the world. And we saw, particularly in Latin America, but also in Africa and other places, French and English multinationals being supported to take over services in different ways, sparking as part of the anti-globalization movement a response and concerns about increases in prices. And so they were interested in, can we use the right to water to stop privatization? We had the development movement, which was concerned particularly about not only lacking rural water supply, but lack of attentions on urban areas. And so human rights activists and development people began to think, can we use the right to water, for example, to get local municipalities to provide water to informal settlements, even though they don't have tenure? And then we had the environmental movement concerned about massive declines in the quality of water, from things like pollution, but also general declining availability of water, which increases the intensity of any pollutants in a water source. And so articulations of the right to water began to percolate up in 1988, 1999. And then I started on 1st November 2001 as a fresh legal officer at an NGO in Geneva, and my boss said, why don't you draft a general comment on the right to water? And so, okay, what does that mean? So I drafted one, got comments from the WHO and two other NGOs, WaterAid, went down to the committee, and that led to the general comment of the right to water, went through in 6 months, the fastest ever time. And it was also a general comment that was right for the moment, because there are all these transnational actors that one wanted to use it. But then important things happened afterwards in terms of getting its legitimacy. Not all states accepted this standard, for example, and the privatization movement also wanted a treaty. But we got an independent expert, Katerina Albuquerque, who really worked in her years to really legitimate the right to water and bring up the right to sanitation, which the committee had in the end decided not to include specifically as a right in the general comment. And then Leo Heller's important work in concretizing many areas, visiting many areas, and doing often what a good special rapporteur does is legitimate local groups in dialogues with their national authority. One of the most important roles of special rapporteurs, and Lara gave a nice introduction to that. Very shortly, what did we expect the right to water to do, and what did it actually do?
You got 2 minutes.
We expected many things. We set up a right to water program. We got funding, and so forth. I think perhaps we expected more legal action. Okay, we actually funded some early litigation in Argentina, supported others. We expected more changes in legislation. That we didn't see, and we can talk about why is that. That's because basically the legal apparatus in most countries is already there if they're going to recognise economic and social rights, right to health, right to housing. Where we saw some important impacts were in the campaign against privatisation, because Right to Water brought together different groups. It gave them a more legitimate discourse, and was also a discourse accepted by the multinational corporations who accepted the right to water. So I've documented in one chapter the extent to which Right to Water helped in stopping privatisations, but also bad economic planning from the multinationals by investing in countries with unstable currencies also destroyed part of the privatisation model. The second aspect is on social mobilisation. That even if it wasn't legally used so much, it seems to be critical in mobilising disparate groups around whether it's polluted water services in the USA, whether it's privatisation campaign, whether it's getting access to water in slums in Kenya. You see Amnesty International come in and really adopting the right to water and sanitation in its work. So I think this social impact, and if you do any Google search on right to water and just start to see how far it spreads, I think that's perhaps been its most important, is to get us to rethink the way we think about poverty, we think about the environment, bringing groups together to mobilise and legitimate different strategies and create different spaces for different stakeholders to negotiate and occasionally find solutions. Thank you.
Wow. This is also a first. Malcolm's kept to the time. So if we could have the three... do you want to have... Okay, so let's have questions on this, and we'll have like 5 minutes from each of the presenters. Would that work? Okay, so any questions for... So these are actually related aspects here, so I think this would be a good point to take. And Lara, who had no conflict of interest there, asking about this question.
I have the microphone. No, I would like Leo to tell us a little bit more about how, depending also on how civil society is well organized when you come for these country missions, your experience, because I was following the discussion about how it went in Mexico and then how it went in India. How do you see the role of civil society and also making the mission something really important and using this mission to gain attention to the problems, mobilizing around this?
Yeah. No, thank you, Lara. It's a good question. No.
The mic's not on, I think.
Hello?
It was turned on.
Was?
Okay. Very technological. Yeah. No, it's a good point, because the country missions are official missions, very formal, and our interlocutor are the governments. And the governments set the main meetings and visits. But also in the country missions, we meet with the civil society. We try the best to meet all the groups that are related to the rights, water and sanitation. But then, in the end, the report finishes with recommendations to the state, mainly. Not only the state, but mainly sometimes there are some recommendations to funders and other official actors. And my view is that when we have a very solid and vibrant civil society in the country, those recommendations can have more impact. They can push the government to follow the recommendation. I'm now developing a project to follow up my previous missions. And what I realize is that in some countries, they, I would say, ignore, but in somehow the governments don't take seriously most of the recommendations. They do the business as usual. But in some countries where the civil society is very active, I can see differences. And Mexico, I would say, is a good example. Because when I went to Mexico, the civil society organized several groups, and we have several meetings with them with a very strict agenda, with points very well chosen. And then they are also following up the government commitment with the report. What happened is that the government changed it there in a few years, I think last year, and then there is a discontinuity in the implementation of the recommendations. But I would say that it's very important when we have groups that can support the implementation of the recommendations. And yeah, I agree with that.
Excellent. Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time. But before anybody asks any more questions, right, so this is being recorded. So if your significant other doesn't know where you are, and you don't wish to be recorded and broadcast, then you can ask the question afterwards in private, and it won't be as much of an issue, perhaps. So I need to stand up here. I can see you. So I have you, sir, and then Pilar.
I wanted to ask Leo and Malcolm, if you have any data on the linkages between water and sanitation and the food chain, because there's lots of water used in the food processing, and pollution, etc. The pollution of the lençol freático, and all this affecting agriculture, and the diseases, the health. Is there data showing this correlation between these water and sanitation problems and these two items I mentioned?
Okay, Pilar, just get a couple. Pilar?
Thank you. Reflecting a bit on the point you made, Bruce, about is this a right, is this a basic service? But thinking about that in the context of the SDGs, one of the things I was struck by, if I saw the slide correctly, is that SDG 16 wasn't mentioned. And so my question is that not potentially a strategic political platform through which to raise the questions of governance, transparency, accountability, access to justice and access to rights through justice, and what is the nature of the conversations happening in the world of SDGs between water and SDG 16? It's a question because
Okay. Leo?
Okay. I'm not very aware of the conversation related to 16. Yes. Actually, I would say that the silos are still there because it's very, very hard to have a cross-sectoral discussion there because there are some custodian agencies for each target, and it's very hard to have a cross-sectional conversation. There is a body named UN Water, where the several UN agencies come together and discuss some of the aspects. But this is, I would say, inside the water sector, not outside the water sector, as you are mentioned, SDG 16. I would say 17 maybe is more related, because 17 has to do with the means of implementation. Related to the other question, yes, I would say that there are several studies, I would say mostly academic studies, showing relationship between the lack of water sanitation and health, mainly. Something related to food. There are some initiatives trying to develop some work on the nexus between water, food, and energy. But in terms of impact, I would say that there is a good body of evidences related to the several impacts on the lack or deficiency in the access to water and sanitation, and several health indicators, particularly children health, diarrhea, helminthiasis, etc. Yeah, and even some meta-analysis showing aggregated outcomes of these studies. But maybe Malcolm can.
Yeah, so quickly on the 2 points. So firstly, in relation to the SDG, so there was goal 16, which originally included human rights and democracy, but China went through the whole document a year before and eradicated any mention to these pretty much. But you can draw a lot from goal 16 in terms of rule of law, access to justice, democracy, and pushing things forwards, and some of the indicators can help you. So it does have some rightsy sort of basis in there. I think goal 5 on water is important to think about because in 2010 the MDG goal on on water was announced as successful. Okay, but it was only closing half the gap. I don't think the right to water had really much to do with helping get to the MDG realisation. But where the right to water helped and sanitation helped was in 2 or 3 areas. Firstly, human rights groups switched in 2010 to actually engaging with the SDG and MDG agenda and trying to get a rights approach in. And that led to the universal goals that we saw on both water and sanitation. And I think we can possibly see right to water having more impact when we come back in 2030 and have this session. Secondly, I think the right to sanitation has the most potential to have impact. Okay, studies I did with the European Union on the use of right to water and sanitation in development cooperation showed sanitation helped most because most states didn't want to receive funding for sanitation because you don't want to talk about piss and shit, but you can take funding for water. So EU officials use the right to sanitation to say, look, you've agreed to this. They use the MDG also for this to try and get them to sign up for sanitation. But sanitation is where the biggest gap is. Like Indonesia invests 1% of what it needs to in order to actually reach the SDGs. On the question on contamination, so correct. I mean, a kilogram of rice requires hundreds of litres of water, okay? There's a whole issue around mineral contaminants in certain foods. But I think one of the key issues for us here is the effect of sanitation on water, and that's why they're so integrated, as Leo said. So the most important thing to do in many ways is to get proper sanitation services, because not only is it important for privacy and dignity, it will dramatically reduce contamination of water services. We've seen even in Norway, okay, sickness and even death, okay, from contamination of water services in the recent years, including here in Bergen. So, and studies show, for example, in Peru, you invest $1 in sanitation, it's $10 in economic growth. And so there's multiple effects. So I think it's important that we keep sanitation up there as much as water.
Excellent. So here's what I propose we do now, is we switch over to have the 3 country case studies from the project present, and then if there's questions at the end, we can come back to questions. You can go down if you want. You don't have to sit in the spotlights if you don't. Yes. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Malcolm. Okay, so slight change of pace here. So what we're going to try and do here is I wanted each of the scholars here to present a little bit about the country study that they're working on and what has been the role of the human right to water and sanitation in that particular country, and can we see how that has changed maybe over time. And if you could take I think if we could do 4 or 5 minutes max, then we can have questions at the end of that. And the feedback is going to be the helpful here. So we start with Namita.
Okay.
So you want to introduce yourself and then...
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. I'm Namita Wahi from the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. And and on this project, apart from me, my colleague Arkaja Singh is also working. And to speak about India as such a big country, it's 1.26 billion people and, the world's largest populous democracy. So what we find is that India is actually not a water scarce country as a whole. So in your map, actually, it wasn't showing any data for India. But as a whole, India is not a water scarce country. You might think that Bergen is the wettest place on earth, having been here for the last 10 days, but actually the wettest place on earth is in India. It's in a place called Cherrapunji in Meghalaya. But we also have deserts, and we have many states in India which do not have enough water. And the monsoon season in India brings a lot of the rainfall that actually replenishes a lot of the water resources. What we are seeing, and with sort of connects with the themes for the rest of the day, is that with climate change and so on, like this year's monsoon, we received as much rain as we did in previous years, but it was very skewed. We've had floods in many, many parts of the country where you would never expect to have floods. And in other parts of the country, there has been a lot of deficit, including in Delhi. So that's the context within which we are operating. And now, in terms of the right to water in India, so India is a post-colonial country, and we've had a series of legislation starting from the Easements Act of 1882, which talk about water. So the Easements Act of 1882 talks about groundwater and basically says that you have an easementary right to water which is under the ground of the place that you are at. There are other laws that regulate the rights to water, including a number of irrigation laws. So speaking to Malcolm's point about, and the point that Leo also raised about whether the right to water includes food and water for subsistence agriculture, we have a number of irrigation laws. We also had a lot of common law tort principles that regulated rights of riparian landowners to water, primarily for irrigation and other purposes, not really drinking water. So this is a background within which we, India becomes independent. We have a constitution. In the constitution, we have a series of fundamental rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and equality. These are judicially enforceable rights. We also have in Part 4 non-justiciable rights. These include rights that are, basically social and economic rights that are considered important for the country, but they're not made judicially enforceable, and include things like the rights to good. It's basically from the labor movement in India, so a lot of rights to good working conditions, education, health, and so on, and also goals of ensuring that the material resources of the community are distributed so as to ensure the good of all, things like that. So cut to the 1980s, we have the case that Malcolm referenced is the Ratlam municipality case, which was essentially an issue about improper sanitation and the municipality not really doing its job about cleaning the drains and so on. But the court articulated the relief that it gave in the context of the right to health. And so what we see is that over the period from 1980 to the present, we have an articulation of several social and economic rights read into the right to life, including the rights to food, education, health, housing, and so on. The right to water is something that is also brought out in the cases that start appearing from the 90s. But the right to water is read into the right to life through the right to environment. So another right that really gets a lot of attention is the right to environment. And there are a lot of cases that involve pollution of water resources like rivers and so on, is where the court is talking about how there is a right to environment, and in that context the court is saying, of course, there's a right to water as part of the right to environment, which means you should not pollute. But the court never sort of articulates the content of a right to water as such. So bottom line, in India, the right to water is well entrenched, but what is the content of it and what it means for effective realization within the context of what the human right to water says, that is not at all clear. And so in this study that I did, I looked at 100 decisions of the high courts, all the decisions of the high courts in India on water. So in India, we have the Supreme Court and we have the high courts. And I looked at 100 decisions which reference the right to water. And I found that only 5 of them really were about drinking water. 10 more were about pollution and therefore pollution of water sources and therefore water. A large number of cases were really people taking to court their rights under various laws, including irrigation laws, rights of riparian owners, and so on. So in that sense, the content of what the right to water means in India is somewhat different from the human right to water. And finally, last point, how am I doing on time?
1 minute.
Okay. Is that, in India, and I mean, this is a point that I've sort of been making in previous sessions as well, is that we find the development discourse always trumps the rights discourse. And we are seeing this not just in the general discourse of the public and in the political discourse and so on, but also in the discourse of the courts. So, for instance, the famous Narmada Bachao Andolan case, where the World Bank for the first time, pulled out from a project, and the World Bank inspection panel was for the first time set up. That case was fought within the rights discourse, but within India, the Supreme Court, though initially giving some relief, eventually decided that development is more important. And so, what that means is that the SDGs SDGs have seemed to have more impact. Talking to Bruce's question at the beginning of the panel is what impact do human rights have? Actually, the SDGs have more impact. So the human right to water and sanitation, Malcolm's working on it in the early 2000s. 2010 is when, the general comment comes out. And we don't really see much happening in India during this time. Of course, there is some stuff in the civil society space, some things that Malcolm mentioned about anti-privatization. There was the Coca-Cola bottling plant, but there's that isolated instance. As a whole, there's not much happening. And then what we find is that the SDGs come out, and then like this government that has been, that was there for the past 5 years, first it made sanitation a priority, and then it made, now it's made water a priority with the water ministry and so on. But it seems that the language in which all of these things are crafted is more the development language rather than the rights language. So I think I'll just stop here.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Evelyn Villareal from Costa Rica.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. This is on. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I first want to thank the Center on Law and Transformation for inviting me here and for being part of this project, very interesting project. I'll have to summarize like 300 pages of our research in one page, so I will just highlight some of the findings that we have so far. As you might know, Costa Rica has a high compliance with the human right to water. It's a different story on sanitation, I have to say. I'm not speaking right now about sanitation, just the human right to water. But it has been challenging by increasing mobilizations in the recent 10 years, I will say. There are 3 types of conflicts related to water. One is the scarcity in some of the regions, in the coasts mainly, and there has been increasing tensions between communities and economic activities, such as tourism, for example, where you can find hotels, really big hotels with super huge swimming pool and a golf camp that requires lots of water, and the community defense is against that. And the second type of conflict will be the agriculture plantations that we were talking about, and they use a lot of pesticides that contaminates the sources of clean water. Actually, the Costa Rican case on pineapple plantations went to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission a couple of years ago. And the third type of conflict is more urban and is related to the growing housing projects, and in a scenario where we have climate change and also fiscal crisis, and the institutions cannot make huge investment on these infrastructure projects. Legal claims are the most popular and frequent mechanism to solve these conflicts, all of these 3 types of conflicts. Despite the country does not have in its constitution or in any law explicitly the human right to water. But Costa Rica approved the treaty, of course, in 2010, and for our if it is approved by the Congress, it becomes part of the national legislation and is above the Constitution. So we do have that integrated, but it's not explicitly yet. In our research, we use data science tools to analyze the resolutions of the Constitutional Court, mainly amparos related to water conflicts. In total, we found 10,000 cases, around 10,000 cases in the last 30 years went to the Constitutional Court. Almost 90% of these 10,000, which is a very, very high judicialization of the water conflicts, 90% were related or mentioned water as a public service. That was the main concern. Only 1% of these cases mentioned the whole sentence, human right to water, only 1% of these sentences. So it's very interesting because some of the sentences that did mention the human right to water came from the 90s, previous to the UN approval in 2010. But you can also find the whole sentence after 2010 more frequently. Half of these cases were dismissed and half were won by the citizens. And we can do all sorts of analysis that we are doing this right now, like mapping them and see the magistrates that rated them and patterns per region, per year, all sorts of things. This analysis is the one that we are doing right now. Other conflicts also motivate social mobilization in the streets. And we found 400 cases related to water conflicts in the last 30 years. This is a very, very low number compared with the average of social mobilizations in the country, which means that water is not in the top 10 of the conflicts in the country. And these mobilizations did not use much the language of human rights. They prefer to use the constitutional rights language. It's a fundamental right, it's related to health rights, it's related to housing rights, but they did not use much the human rights word.
Evelyn, 1 minute.
Yes, I'm just, the political arena is not very popular there. First, because it's very, very hard with the current composition of the legislative to approve a new law. Lobby and legal mobilization was very important early in 2000s, but there was a broad citizen movement trying to update our water law, which comes from 1942. So, but sadly, this never got any results in the legislative. So I will just summarize that, saying that despite the lack of the human right in our constitution or in any legislation explicitly in the national legislation, there is still a high compliance in the country with very low variations among rural and urban. But still we're facing increasing conflicts regarding the use of water for economic activities such as tourism and plantations, and for the urban growing. And most of these conflicts ended up in the Constitutional Court as a form of an amparo with different outcomes. Yep, that's it, pretty much.
Thank you.
You?
And finally, we have Lara Cortes on Brazil.
So for the case of Brazil, maybe I should mention that we don't have the right to water in the constitution. We were visited by Catarina, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to water, and one of her recommendations was that we should include the right to water in the constitution. There have been several attempts, but it has not passed until now. So, but we have a constitution with several social rights, and the right to water could build on the right to health, for example, or the rights to life, or even the principle of human dignity. What we looked at in Brazil, we were looking at 3 different areas, focusing first on court cases, on media, and mobilization. I would just give you a short introduction of each of these topics, and you can discuss further. On media, I found really interesting, because what we found is that when we have like crises, as we have the water crisis in São Paulo, then the topic goes like it's more often debated, of course, especially because it's São Paulo, and I'm talking now about the main newspapers in Brazil, okay? So we see this, and then we see mentions to the human right to water, not very often, but we see that crisis periods, the language comes, and we see more often. But we don't see, so I think media is not really the best place to look for what is really happening on the ground, especially if it's not in São Paulo and Rio, for the case of Brazil. So I was looking at a local struggle for water, in Correntina, in the countryside of Bahia, where the discussion is not only access to water, but who decides on who is using water and how much, So, and I realized that I was expecting to find something on the news. I said, okay, at least Correntina, because it's a case I heard a lot about during the Alternative World Water Forum. I saw they were mobilizing in contact with the Ministério Público and so on. And then I find nothing, almost nothing. And then I looked at the local newspaper, and again, the only news I found were mentioning disruptive actions by the movements. So we don't see the mobilization around in all the discussions. We see when they invade, take a farm and then destroy something, and then they are presented as criminals. So this is reported, and then again, the action. So what I see is that the rights to property of these farms are, I would say, taking the case to the news, but not all this mobilization. It goes with our discussions on criminalization of social movements on several areas, including this. So this is, of course, I have not written yet on this, so this I'm sharing with you, and I'd like to have your reflections on this, which would help me also working on the material I have collected. On the court cases, also have just this week finished looking at what we have until now, but of course there is still a lot to be explored. But I looked at the Supreme Court. We don't have a right to water defined by, no cases were taken, and the Supreme Court had not defined a right to water in any case. But we have several cases in appeal courts of the states, most taken by individuals in relation to disconnections. Most cases are this. But we also see cases, for example, all the cases we found in Espírito Santo were related to this Mariana disaster that we had caused by a mining company that polluted the water, and then so individuals going to courts asking compensation. And one very interesting thing we found, so all these cases mention the human right to water, and what we found is that the ruling says, well, this should be solved as a collective problem, and there is a process going on in Minas Gerais to deal with this, the state where the problem was caused. But in any case, they say this should be solved, but then they give the compensation for each person anyway. So this is very interesting, and it also links to our judicial system and the way they deal better with individual cases than collective cases. So they say expressly this should be dealt with as a collective problem, but I'll give you it's easier for me to give you a compensation here. But of course we have a lot of things to explore still. But I found interesting that so the human right to water is also used there. And in the last, I have 1 minute? Yes. I think I've started already a little bit with this mobilization, saying about mobilization against privatization. I think this is where the human right to water in Brazil is used very strongly as the slogan of this Alternative World Water Forum. So the Alternative World Water Forum used the human right to water and even the resolution as part of their slogan. And after that, of course, not because the right itself, but the event, the Alternative World Water Forum, a group of people who have been working for a good while already opposing privatization, have institutionalized a group, which is now called, it's an observatory. Leo is also part of this group. National Observatory of the Human Rights to Water and Sanitation in Brazil. This is, I stop here, maybe.
Thank you. So if we can collect a bunch of questions, and then for any one of the three, or Leo or Malcolm, That's. Anybody want to start? Remember, you're being recorded.
Thank you. I have a question for Evelyn for the Costa Rican case. Maybe I didn't understand very well, so if that's the case, just tell me. It's like you say Costa Rica has like a high level of compliance, and at the same time you mention more than 10,000 cases. And although you say they're related to water as a public service, I was wondering what are the problems then with the right to with water services and the right to water there, because it's a lot of litigation for something that it seems not to be a problem for the country, you know. So I was kind of intrigued by that.
Should I?
No, let's take a couple of questions first, and then we can do like round robin. It'll be quicker. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Lara. On the legal part. Is there any action that you know taken by the Ministério Público in Minas Gerais or in Brazil?
Okay, another question. Leo, of course.
Just a provocation.
Even better.
Yes, I realized that.
Shouldn't they come also and join us?
No,
here?
just a
Okay.
brief question. I realized that there were visits of special rapporteur in the 3 countries.
Yes.
And maybe it would be interesting to see if in the moment of previously, during, and just after the visits, at least the language of the human rights to water and sanitation started to appear in the media, in the civil society, and also the governments. I'm not proposing to do an in-depth assessment of the visits, but to see the impact of the visits, at least on the language. I think it would be interesting.
I think it'd be very interesting. Okay, one more question, then we'll go to some answers at the back here. Sorry. Sure.
Thanks. I have a question for Leo. You talked about the influence of civil society actors on your work or on the special procedures. I would be interested in if you also feel pressure from the business sector from.
Okay.
Maybe you can, since it's recorded, maybe you cannot speak so much about it, but maybe you can give some insight.
Okay, thanks. Leo, do you want to come back up here? Yes. And Mo, you can come back over here if you want. So, Evelyn, the first question was to you, and we can go around from there.
No, you understood well. It's very interesting. We have one of the highest litigation rates in Latin America, in the Americas in general. We judicialize everything. I mean, in Costa Rica, if you have a problem with your neighbor, you go to courts. You don't speak with him or her. You go to court and put a claim against him. It's a really, really high rate of litigation for everything. And so 10,000 sounds like too much, but in terms of the Constitutional Court, that was only 2% of their cases in these 30 years. And most of them, as I mentioned, they were related to public services, and there were individual claims of people that is asking to get the drinking water in new housing projects. So if the housing project has, let's say, 3,000 houses, you will have 3,000 claims. So that's why the number is very high. And also people that lives far away, where still the drinking water service is not there, so they also put a claim. And so most of it is, I will say, is individual claims, rights, trying to get drinking water in their new house or in their houses in remote areas. And there are a bunch of them, which are the most interesting, but the fewer, is related to contamination with social conflicts in some specific areas. And also, I think I'm not sure, and I have to double check this, but I think the visit of the rapporteur was focused, as far as I read, on a mining project in Cruzitas.
No, it was general.
I'm not sure when. Maybe
Yes.
2010,
Wasn't-
11.
It was quite recent, but relatively recent, yeah.
Katarina went there.
Yes, yes. No, she was there. I'm sure about it. But I will say that the language of human rights right now, and in the cases, it's concentrated on an elite of lawyers, environmentalist lawyers, very, very specialized. And they are the ones who are using even the Child Rights Convention. I mean, they are the ones that are totally aware of all the instruments in the international arena, and they are the ones that are using more the language and their strategies.
Okay. Lara, and then Leo, and then Namita.
Am I on? Sorry, now, yes.
Yes.
So, where is him? Yeah, outside there. So yes, I know the Ministério Público has working, not only taking case to the courts, but also celebrating agreements with parts involved in several other institutions. We have here a promotora de justiça from Minas Gerais. That would be better place to give you more details about that. And by coincidence, one of the cases I found from Minas Gerais that I will explore, because it's not an individual case, so it's much more interesting for me. She's involved in this case, so we'll probably have interviews afterwards when I know more about the case. Yes, I think in relation to the visit, the official mission, we all could explore more. I know that for the case of India, Matilda, who wrote her master's, was there and even met Leo Heller. And this, I think I'd like to mention to the students the challenges also, because that she faced. She wanted to go to India to understand a little bit more of the importance and the impact, but it was really difficult because the agenda is almost top secret, right? And then she was, and even if Leo wanted to be he was very generous and positive, but we didn't know exactly who he would meet, and it's part of how things work, the protocol. But then she went to India in any case, and she was invited by one of our organizations, says, "We are meeting with him, would you like to join?" And then all of a sudden, Leo says, "Wow, you're here." So this was very interesting. She was supervised by City Globe here. But I think we should all work more on understanding the impact of, and I say this is very in a humble way, because what I have explored so far was specifically this recommendation for including the right to water in the Constitution, but of course I should know more, and I will. Maybe next panel, you can ask me again. Yes.
Leo?
But I have a question to Leo, sorry. It's just...
Are we taking... I don't think we're taking...
No, I remember... Sorry, but it's just... I remember, and if you have time for this, but I remember he was mentioning that when he started as a special rapporteur, he said, well, okay, it's access to drinking water. And then he realized, okay, and then he mentioned a little bit this idea of looking at mega projects. I would like, if we have time here, that you develop this. How was this process of saying, well, my mandate cannot be so strict and restricted to this aspect? Yeah, but...
Leo?
Hello. Not sure how to...
Use the other mic.
Hello.
Just use this one.
First, I need to talk to everybody. So I have often some interactions with mainly the association of business, not to particular companies. There is an association named Aquafed that join together the big companies. And usually they attend some of my expert consultations, and I need to say, they provide good inputs on some of the issues. But of course, it's not an influence. I'm just taking their opinions, their views, and filtering them and using as useful. And in some of the country visits, I met with some companies. I remember in Mexico, they pushed a lot to have a meeting with me. And in Mexico, you know, I think we have several Latin Americans here. The civil society in Mexico is very vibrant. They have a very hard movement anti-privatization, and there are some cities, some important cities in Mexico that are privatized. And I met a group of maybe 6 managers of the companies, and they try to make the point that their systems are the best in the countries, but obviously I needed to filter and to relativize what they said, because on the other side, the civil society said that they charge too much, the systems are unaffordable, and my decision was not to enter into the discussion in Mexico because it's not easy to compare all the systems. So what I'm saying that, okay, I'm open to talk to them, but it's not a lobby that they do into the mandate. Your question was about?
How you
developed. Yeah. It's a good question. What's the boundary of the mandate? There is a push to limit the mandate only to the access to services. And because one of the reasons is that there are other mandates that deal with other aspects of water. For instance, the mandate on environment, there is a rapporteur on hazard wastes. But it's impossible to be confined to specific issues. So the issue of mega projects it's a good example. The issue of international cooperation, because the international cooperation is not only to water. Sometimes the funding is for a group of interventions. And what I try to do is not to go beyond too much of the mandate. And when I look, for instance, to mega projects impact several rights, not only the right to water and sanitation, was to give a focus on the water sanitation area.
Okay, Namita?
I think, can I use my time to actually pose a question to Leo, or no?
You can do anything you want.
Thank you. Could you speak about your visit to India? Because as Lara said, it was, it wasn't as well publicized as it should have been. And I think definitely we've been looking at some of the media analysis of, the usage of the right to water. And after this workshop, Malcolm has showed us new techniques, so we can deepen that analysis. But what we are finding is that there isn't as much as one would like, and also so far we've only looked at the English language media, but I know that, for instance, during your visit you spent some time in Calcutta as well, and India has so many languages, and it's harder to sort of like track the local languages, and that's perhaps where a lot of the action is. So we have to sort of think about, so accept your provocation and sort of think about how to deepen the work on the media analysis. But if you could speak about your visit to India and how easy or difficult it was for you to speak to the government and to civil society.
Definitely not easy. It was definitely the most complex visit I did for several reasons. I don't need to explain the complexity, the diversity, and how it's so hard in 2 weeks to cover all the regional aspects. And it was very, very hard. And this was even one point that the government made on my statement, how this rapporteur came here, stay 2 weeks, and give so definitive conclusions, etc. Yeah, so it was very hard. And I need to say, it was the hardest relationship with a government in the end of the visit. The contact with the government was nice during these 2 weeks, the national government and also the local governments. But there is a very huge program there, the Swachh Bharat mission, that is a very ambitious program. I would say a good program, because the ambition is to end open defecation in few years during the mandate of the previous mandate of Modi, I think in 2019. The end of 2018, the goal was to end open defecation through a massive intervention. part of intervention was based in behavior change, because, of course, we need behavior change on that. And what I did in my final statement was to say it's a great project, it's very important, very relevant, but always there is a but in a final statement. But there are some concerns related to human rights, and of course there are. I saw and I heard several concerns from the communities, from the civil society, related to several aspects on how to make people not to defecate in open, with several concerns related to the relationship between the managers and the people. And the government, in the end, didn't like my statement, and they published a letter, a press release to the media, and attacking strongly what I would say. One of the arguments was that, how in 15 days you can say that, and several other arguments. And I would say that the media was very balanced in terms of how to consider both views. Some reinforced more the government views, and others supported a lot, particularly the international agencies supported a lot my report, not the report, my statement. This is the end of mission statement. And then when I presented the final report, I was surprised because the government was silent in the Human Rights Council. I was understanding that they would react and criticize the report, and nothing happened. And the final word was mine.
Perfect.
I would say that, you know, there are different media vehicles there. Some were more, what they say was simply reproduce the text of the statement and the text of the government statement. Some put more strengthened in the government statement, and some more in my statement. And most of them are more balanced, saying the rapporteur said that and the government said that, and not judging where the truth is.
So, really quickly from Lara, then Malcom, and then...
Very brief comment is that this reaction is not exclusive for India, because now I just remember that one of the few news I found in Brazil was a very angry reaction from the governor of São Paulo, Geraldo Alckmin, because of something that Catalina said that...
it was after the visit.
Yes, but that's what I mean. It's like this strong, and even it was really something, I don't remember the wording now, but it was something really strong against her comment on the water crisis in São Paulo. Right. So on the government's behavior in relation to the water crisis.
She had a party, she was linked to the...
Malcom?
Okay.
Just two quick things. Just to the first question about the paradox, where you can have a country where everybody almost has access to water at a good level, and then some people have very little access at all. And this is a paradox which is quite particular to the right to water, or it's also a bit like torture protection. So in Bulgaria and Romania, Hungary, you have 99% access to water, but then you have 1%, the ethnic Roma, which have almost no access at all. And so it's very different, say, from a right to social security, where 4 billion people don't have access to a proper level, but it's a different type of dynamic here. And that's what makes a rights approach useful, is actually focusing on the marginalized, because usually the average is perfectly fine. And that's a real space for it. The second point is on the question to Leah, or your question about the role of special rapporteurs. And that raises a broader methodological issue about how we study impact. Because what we see here, if we look back in 25 years, is a whole rolling series of international and national initiatives that start with, a bottom-up approach. Let's get the general comment, standards set out. Then let's get in special rapporteurs to legitimate the right to water and go out, which they do in that early phase. Then let's get a Human Rights Council, General Assembly, let's get constitutional reform. If you come in at any point and study just one of those different things, you're going to get a different answer compared to the others. So I think, how do we take a dynamic approach to the study of impact and see the different intervening variables and be clear about it? I think it's quite a relevant point to many of our research agendas.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I think I mean, it's a really, really good point. So, but I mean, there seems like the tenor of the panel is almost like that it's made no difference. But I think it's not what anybody actually here is meaning, right? Because there's other ways of looking at impact. And so, just by way of a little anecdote, right? So when
I don't think that's the tenor of the panel.
it can sound like that, right? It might not be what, because that's we're there's no identification of this is that right in action. This is the outcome.
I think it's literally a glass of water, half empty, maybe then half full, but it's still half empty.
So it brings up this whole question about, so how do you use the right? And so when we first had this kickoff workshop in Costa Rica, and we had these people there from civil society and people who were from the government agencies, and we asked them, so the international human right to water, important? Oh, yeah, really, really important. I said, so how do you use it? Oh, no, we don't use it, right? But it's not that it's unimportant, right? But it did inform what they were doing. And then it comes to what Dan presented last time about this idea of having a deck of cards, and that you play different cards in different places, depending on, in Costa Rica, there's a legal opportunity structure that's wide open. So why not litigate, because it's almost free. Whereas other ones, you might do something else. But even within the legal opportunity structure, you might play different cards, right? So we know what the Costa Rican Constitutional Court is going to say about an environmental law, right, or an environmental case. We know what the jurisprudence looks like. So you can frame a water question as an environmental question or as a health question where we know what the jurisprudence looks like. We know how to frame that. We don't know what they're going to say about the international right to a human right to water, even though it does, as Evelyn said, it supersedes the Constitution. It's like super constitutional. But we don't know how they're going to react to that. But we do know these other ones. You get a one-shot game to go take your case to the court, but we do know this one works, so that's what you're going to use. Whereas in other countries, perhaps, they don't have that. They have no record of being able to leverage other types of rights to get the water one. Then maybe that's where you start to find people litigating on the right to water. So I think a really, really interesting panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd also like to make a corrective. I had not been able to read my notes properly at the beginning. I actually forgot to mention that Siri has been working on the impact of international norms in this project as well. I felt very bad about that. And so this is, and Mattia, where's Mattia? Oh.
Catalina.
I mentioned Catalina. Don't get off your high horse. Sorry, I did that already. So I want to thank you for the really... Angelica, she's not here. Okay, so hopefully she won't watch the video. Won't realize that I... Thank you. Yes, so these are my culpa mia. So I want to thank the panel once more and Leo Heller for coming to Bergen on a very wet August. And thank you very much. It's been very instructive. Thank you. Yeah. Oh. Okay. This is really complicated.